When I was a kid, I was obsessed with milk. We all had that phase, right? Where there was a food or drink that we just couldn't get enough of and wanted it morning, noon, and night. That was me with milk. I could drink it by the gallon, and my parents didn't mind. They would rather I wanted something healthy like that to quench my thirst than be consistently after soda or one of those concentrated drinks full of sugar that you just add water to. I could make myself sick sometimes, drinking too much too fast. But didn't every kid? Hell, even adults can have too much of a good thing and make themselves ill for it. It was never enough to put me off, though. No amount of aching bellies could separate me from my beloved milk. Nothing could. Or so I thought. See, our kitchen was pretty small, or at least it was too small to fit in the gigantic fridge and freezer that my parents had. So it was kept in the basement instead. One summer, when I was around 16, my parents decided that I was old enough to stay home alone while they took off on a second honeymoon or something. I didn't mind, though. At that age, I would have rather stayed home with my friends than been a third wheel to my parents as they tried to rekindle the romance. Besides, if I needed an adult, my grandparents lived right across the street. Yeah, my family was the kind who didn't stray too far from their roots. It was pretty uneventful, as you might expect. I had friends over and we played video games, picked out on takeout, and that was about it, beyond me taking care of the house duties. Until the third week. The house was so old, so the creaks and groans and other unexplained noises were something I was used to at this point, and easily brushed aside. This one night, however, I had just come back from the basement, the door to which lay in our kitchen, with a glass of milk, ready to crawl up the stairs and settle into bed for the night. Then I heard an unusual banging that came from the room I just left. I tried to brush it off as just the ancient stairs airing out their complaints after I'd trampled up them, but there was something so off about it. In my 16 years of living in that house, I never heard anything like it. I figured it might have been a wild animal, maybe a raccoon or a possum that had somehow gotten in during the day. Being a typical teen, that was not something that I wanted to deal with late at night, so I simply locked the basement door to prevent it from getting up to the main house when I went to bed. Morning came and I tentatively went down into the basement to check for any signs of a wild animal, and beyond the few cobwebs to be expected, even in a furnished basement like our own, there was nothing. So I decided it really had just been one of my many noises that the house makes. Got my usual glass of milk and headed back upstairs. Later that night, the noise returned. And this time I was sure it wasn't simply random creaking, because it started up at the exact same time right before I headed up to my room for the night. The only difference was I hadn't been down in the basement yet, so definitely wasn't the result of me stepping on some well-worn floorboards. Being not the particularly brave teen that I was, I bolted out of the house and across to my grandparents. Fortunately, they were still awake, and my grandfather was a bull of a man not to be messed with. He marched over with his shotgun to investigate, only to come back half an hour later claiming he couldn't find anything or anyone. He reasoned, like me, that maybe it was just a raccoon, and it was hiding in a nook or cranny somewhere down there. So we locked up the home just to stop it from getting out as much as I had done the previous night. I stayed at my grandparents' from that point on, going back into the house during the day to take care of any chores and play on my Nintendo for a couple hours. I didn't go back down into the basement. I just opted to eat and drink at my grandparents' house. About a week before my parents got back, there was a summer storm that caused a power outage. It lasted a couple days, but it gave me all the more reason to spend the remaining time at my grandparents' house while my parents were away. When I returned one morning to open up the curtains, I noticed a foul smell spreading through the house. Knowing the power had been out, I assumed the heavy, pungent odor was coming from the food in the fridge and the freezer that must have begun to go bad. The thought of dealing with it was unpleasant, but It wasn't something I wanted my parents to come home to. I didn't want to deal with the cleanup, and my grandparents would be out of town for the night visiting my great uncle, and I didn't much fancy having to clear out the rotting food alone. So I did what any bone-idled teenager would do, and I left it. Sprayed some air freshener in hopes to deal with it for the next day, choosing to eat dry cereal and drink water rather than going down to the basement and be overwhelmed by that stench. That night was particularly hot, even for summer, so I ended up turning on the AC. The cool air spreading through the house was a relief as I went to sleep, but it was soon a decision I was regretting. I woke up at around 4 in the morning to find that the air in the house was thick and muggy. It was worse than when I've gone to bed. Worse still was the stench was so strong I could taste it in my mouth. It was sweet and sour at all the same time, mixed with the sulfuric smell of rotting eggs and something my adolescent brain just could only describe as someone having missed the toilet. I thought about a time when I was younger, when my dad had accidentally unplugged the fridge and none of us had noticed until the milk had gone off. I could remember that smell as I gagged and hurried to the upstairs bathroom, kneeling before the toilet as my stomach threatened to empty itself. It was sweet and bitter like this smell, with something acidic I'd never known how to explain, and I could just remember the thick, chunky sludge that the milk had become. None of this helped me as the scent that had filled the house seemed to flood every pore of my body. I could smell it on my clothes, and it was so strong that my eyes watered, and with one final heavy flip, my stomach heaved and I vomited. How could the smell have gotten so bad in just a few hours? It was only when I was cleaning myself up at the sink that I noticed that the air vents weren't pushing out any soothing cool air. Knowing that, I obviously hadn't turned it off as I'd been sleeping. I assumed that the system was still messed up after the power outage. I couldn't stay in that house with that heat and that smell, so, dressed only in my underwear, I hurried over to my grandparents and, once again, spent the night there. When they arrived in the morning, I explained the situation to them. Neither were pleased that I hadn't taken care of the rotting food the day before, but they agreed to help before it can get any worse. Now, worse would have been an understatement for the odor that smacked us in the face. My grandmother couldn't even make it into the house. She went white and bent over the table on the porch, gagging. Even my grandfather lost his hardened composure upon setting foot into the house, having brought a tissue out of his pocket to cover his nose and mouth. "Stay here," he told me, a clear command. Even his words had been a little muffled. I, of course, didn't listen to him, because it made no sense to me for him to make me stay out and have him clean up all the mess himself. And once I heard the basement door open, I cut through the house into the kitchen. I can only describe walking into that kitchen as having your face milliliters away from an oven door when it's open, and the wave of heat knocks you off your feet. It was that, but only the smell. I could hear my grandfather retching and coughing as he descended the stairs, and I myself was soon doing the same as I made my way into the basement, with tears forming in my eyes. Now, my grandfather was a hard man, but I've never heard him swear until that moment, and it was as if he was making up for a lifetime of never saying a bad word with a string of curses leaving him. This urged me on through the heated murk of stench that made going down the stairs a grinding task. I wish I had listened to my grandfather when he told me to stay outside with my grandma. He tried to urge me back up before I saw anything, but it was much too late for that now. The noises that I heard from the basement weren't from the house settling, nor were they from an animal. They were from a human now rotting in the summer heat and half hanging out of an air vent. Now I knew why they'd stopped working, and how the smell had taken over the whole house so quickly. It also explained why neither me or my grandfather had found anything upon investigating the basement, they'd been in the vents. The fact that a person had somehow gotten into my home was chilling enough, and to see them as the first dead body in my life was worse. Death is a part of nature, but a disgusting part when the usual human ways of dealing with it aren't in practice. A body rots quickly in heat, and their corpse was hanging in such a way that I'm sure if it had been left another day or two, the body would have snapped in half. Fluids leaking down the walls, congealed blood, dirty brown liquid, and I didn't want to think about it. But the worst of it all, some thick, white, pus-like thing that reminded me of that sour milk. The smell of death clings to everything, and even after the body was removed, all furniture from down there was tossed out, and the basement was professionally fumigated. It still lingered. I threw out the clothes that I'd been wearing that day. No matter how many times that they were washed, it was still there. I couldn't go down to that basement, and it still hit me like a truck each time I passed the door. Even my parents, who were fortunate enough to still be gone during the worst of it, couldn't deal with the smell. They moved a street over, and from what my grandparents have told us, whenever someone new moves in, they always complain about the smell. We never did figure out how they got in, and the police believe that there must have been some open window I missed one day, but I'm inclined to agree. They were homeless, looking for food and shelter, and it's something that I couldn't hold against them. I almost feel guilty in a way. The noises that they made sneaking around the basement at night drove me away to my grandparents. Maybe if I just stayed, I would have heard them call for help, if they called for it at all when I got stuck in the vent. Maybe they'd still be alive, I don't know. What I do know is from that day on, I couldn't drink milk anymore. The smell of even fresh milk would bring the reek of death back to me, like it just had been trapped and waiting somewhere in the back of my nose. The sight of it reminded me of those fluids seeping down our basement walls. When I was a kid, I loved milk. Now I hate it.